There's a specific type of quiet person who reads more, thinks deeper, and plans better than everyone else, and ends up with nothing to show for it. I was that person. And if you've got notebooks full of ideas but a life that feels stuck on pause, I need to tell you something uncomfortable. There is a certain kind of quiet person who ends up losing years to an illusion that feels noble while it's happening. I know this because I was one of them. I spent 10 full years of my life circling the edges of the things I wanted, but never quite touching them. 10 years is long enough for a child to go from kindergarten to high school, long enough for a new industry to appear, long enough for an entire identity to calcify without you noticing. And I told myself a beautiful story to make it all feel intentional. I'm waiting for meaning. I'm searching for my real thing. I refuse to settle for anything shallow, anything temporary, anything that doesn't feel like destiny humming in my bone. In the moment, those sentences sounded intelligent, principled, spiritual. Looking back, they were fear in a silk robe. Every time I stood in front of a new idea, I held it hostage to impossible expectations. If I can't predict where this will be in 5 years, I won't start. If this project doesn't feel world-changing, it's not worth attempting. If it doesn't feel like soul purpose, why bother? If I don't feel ready, I must wait. I didn't realize it then, but each sentence was an escape hatch disguised as wisdom. I wasn't protecting my future. I was protecting myself from the heat of beginning. And while I was doing that, life kept moving around me with a remarkable indifference. People who didn't read as deeply, who didn't debate themselves into paralysis, people who simply chose something and stepped forward, passed me like commuters on a platform. I watched them with a mix of envy and irritation. How dare they be so untroubled? How dare they be at peace with good enough? Didn't they feel the gravity of choosing a path? Didn't they know a calling was supposed to feel sacred? Then one day, anger gave way to something quieter, something sharper, grief. Because I finally realized they weren't careless. They were simply starting. And I wasn't. There was a moment, somewhere in my early 30s, when it hit me with blunt force. I had accumulated a graveyard of pristine ideas with nothing alive to show for them. My notebooks were perfect. My plans were intricate. My standards were sky high. And my life was still on pause. I had been worshiping the idea of potential while neglecting the practice of progress. The worst part was how proud I felt about it. I thought having 20 internal filters made me discerning. I thought my reluctance made me someone who took life seriously. It didn't. It only proved I was building a cage out of my own expectations. At some point, I had to face a truth so obvious it felt insulting. Meaning doesn't precede action. Passion doesn't precede action. Clarity doesn't precede action. Only action precedes action. Not elegant action. Not visionary, polished, well-funded action. Just the plain, awkward, unremarkable first steps. The kind that look ridiculous from the outside and even more ridiculous from the inside. You don't discover your thing by thinking harder. You discover it by touching reality, by getting dirty, by making mistakes that bruise your pride, by sending work into the world that embarrasses you, by enduring the quiet humiliation of producing something that falls flat, and then, despite all of that, feeling an inexplicable desire to try again tomorrow. This was what I didn't understand during the decade I threw away. The warmth of meaning appears after you earn the calluses. It does not announce itself at the beginning. It grows out of repetition, contact, friction, human error. Once I saw that, I had to admit one last thing. My biggest obstacle had never been lack of purpose. It was the fantasy that purpose should introduce itself before I moved. I was waiting for a permission slip that could only be issued by the version of me who had already begun. That realization didn't fix everything. Realizations rarely do, but it cracked something open. Enough to let a new rule enter. A rule so embarrassingly small, it felt like cheating. When I'm about 30% sure, I start. Not 80. Not 60. Not even 50. 30% certainty. 30% excitement. 30% clarity. 30% competence. Anything more is a luxury. Anything less is usually fear, pretending to be wisdom. This principle pried my life open after a decade of paralysis. 30% was enough to begin, and enough to stay humble. It pulled me out of fantasy and into experimentation, because once I accepted that the first attempt could be terrible, the pressure dissolved. I didn't need to begin with significance. I only needed to begin. So I posted half-formed ideas. I sent unpolished pitches. I recorded videos where my voice shook. I treated everything as a 3-month experiment instead of a life sentence. And something strange happened. The meaning I'd been chasing for 10 years showed up about 6 months into doing something I was only 30% sure about. It arrived quietly, without ceremony, as if it had been waiting for me to finally meet it halfway. I say this without drama. I am not special. I don't have a genius threshold or a destiny-scented intuition. I simply learned that beginnings are not supposed to feel right. They are supposed to feel small. Anyone can do this, including you. There is a moment in everyone's life when they finally understand something uncomfortable but liberating. The distance between where you are and where you want to be is not determined by talent or timing or luck. It is determined by one skill: the ability to begin before you feel ready. For people like us, this isn't a mild adjustment. It is a psychological rewiring. We grew up believing the noble path was the careful one, the intentional one, the one where you wait for alignment, for clarity, for certainty. We were rewarded for sensitivity, for introspection, for thinking deeply before acting. No one warned us that these strengths could calcify into hesitation if left unchecked. So let's widen the frame for a moment. Let's look at what the 30% rule actually disrupts. It disrupts the myth that decisions must be lifelong. When you treat everything as a 3-month experiment, you stop asking, what if this is the wrong path? And start asking, what can I learn in 90 days? One question freezes you, the other moves you. It disrupts the myth that competence must come first. Competence never precedes practice. Practice creates competence. We all know this logically, but still expect our first attempt to reveal something profound about who we are. It won't. It is just your first data point. You need many before a pattern appears. It disrupts the myth that passion feels like lightning. More often, passion begins as a quiet preference, something you tolerate, then enjoy, then miss, then defend. Most people never reach that stage because they quit long before the relationship can deepen. And most importantly, it disrupts the myth that you must pick the perfect thing. You don't. You only need to pick one thing for now, something real enough to touch, something that generates feedback instead of fantasies, something with edges you can hold, because the world does not respond to your potential. It responds to your participation. This is why I keep thinking about the quiet, thoughtful people who disappear into someday, the ones with notebooks full of ideas, phones full of screenshots, hearts full of private enthusiasm, but nothing visible in the world. Often, these are the kindest people, the most perceptive, the ones whose work would genuinely help others if it ever made it out of their heads. I know this terrain intimately, and I know the escape hatch is smaller and simpler than it looks. You begin with the smallest possible unit of progress. 25 minutes. One ugly draft. One email sent before you can overthink it. One attempt that embarrasses you slightly. You release it while your hand is still shaking. And then, crucially, you return tomorrow. Not because the work felt meaningful, but because you are practicing being a person who practices. And this is where something subtle begins to shift. The emotional change happens not in the outcome, but in your identity. Each time you move before you're ready, you teach yourself a new truth. That your life is allowed to move. That action does not need certainty's permission. That you can tell the difference between fear and intuition. Between discipline and pressure. Between experiments and commitments. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, your internal narrative changes. You stop asking, "Is this my purpose?" You start asking, "What happens if I keep going?" There is an ocean of difference between those two questions. The first one freezes you. The second one frees you. Over time, something else happens too. The grief you carry for the years you lost begins to soften. It becomes less of a wound and more of a reference point. You start to see that your hesitation was never laziness, never a lack of ambition. It was simply the absence of a framework that honored both your sensitivity and your potential. Once you have that framework, the past stops being a verdict. It becomes an education. And as you continue, something warm begins to take shape inside you. You notice small traces of meaning, not the cinematic lightning bolt kind, but a quieter, steadier kind, a direction that emerges from contact rather than contemplation, a sense that follows your footsteps instead of preceding them. This is the paradox at the heart of beginning. The thing you've been searching for only appears once you stop searching and start building. So, let me close with the same invitation, but now with the full weight of everything you've just read. Pick one thing you've been circling for months or years. Give yourself 25 minutes today. Make the smallest, roughest, most inelegant version you can tolerate and finish it before the timer ends. Not because it will change your life today, not because it will reveal your purpose, not because it will be good. Do it because your life is waiting for you on the other side of beginning. Do it because every day you delay, your potential grows heavier. Do it because thoughtful people deserve momentum, not paralysis. Do it because someone out there needs what you might eventually create. And above all, do it because someday is not a date. It is a trap. You don't owe the world a masterpiece today. You owe it motion. You owe it participation. You owe it the courage to be seen in your early, imperfect form. Your someday is today, even if today looks ridiculous.